天，所以我们整个的这样子的一个培训的一个课程，其实变成比较深入，然后比较详细哦。那第二个当然，其实我们今年其实是有很多。国外的一个讲者，我们包括 AP 那个这边的首席科学家那个 Goeff Huston， 还有那个他的AP 那个产品经理这个部分，就是 Tom Harrison 这个部分呢，他都会为我们，他们在长期在 ITF 都有甚至其实他们是在主持的一个 position 哦，那所以在这部分我们希望他带来给我们更多的一些第一这样子的一个经验。那当然，其实我们这次其实也很感谢哈，其实我们有很多国内这边来参与来分享的哈。那当然包括我们这边的那个前市长郑天来前市长这个地方其实来给我们。这个部分的一个经验。那今年这次我们其实也请到这个瑞昱半导体科技这边黄副处长黄凯哲副处长这个地方，其实也帮我们来做一个相关的一个引言。那还有3位的讲者哈，那包括中央大学的那个周立德特聘教授，那还有就是林政伟教授，济南大学林政伟林教授，那当然还有现场的那个湖北这个科技大学的那个苏教授，都是长期在耕耘在这一块里面。那从一个台湾这边自己本土的这样子的一个角度来做一个相关的一个分享。那我们见到一个，当然其实在这一块，其实我们希望其实每年其实持续来做这个培育啦。那这边也小小的做一下这个行销一下哈，就是说大家这边假说有来报名这个 ITF， 其实是都有这个兴趣哈。那我们现在每年其实都有一个培养一个 ITF 的 Fellow， 那我们这边会赞助他1年，其实去参加3次 ITF。去现场这个地方来做这样子的最实战的这样子的一个参与跟经验。那我们现在大概11月开始我们会开始接受报名，那12月底之前我们会接着报名，应该是12月底之前我们会公布明年的甄选。那大家对于 ITF 这边有兴趣的话，麻烦密切就是关注我们这边的一个官网吼，那来参加我们 ITF 的 Fellow 的一个选拔。那我在这边就祝这次的这个座谈还有这个 workshop 这个工作坊这个部分呢圆满顺利成功，谢谢。
于执行长、那个苏教授，还有那个黄副处长，还有各位那个贵宾、各位专家先进，我想非常荣幸哦。还有线上的那些朋友们哦，因为我们看不到你，如果等一下有问题，可能可以透过我们这跟我们讨论了。好，那大家早安，我想大家好，我想我个人很荣幸。那虽然我在 TW 成立到现在，好像都有，但只有退休后一段时间比较没有接触，但是在一些研究案，一些都有那个接触到这些案子。所以这次呢，我们是以 IETF 过去我比较少接触，都是因为一些网络部分。我过去那个 IETF 这个标准与实务的分享的话，这个是研讨会，对我们整个未来的发展很有，因为我们是 ICT 的强国，我们硬体方面是相当不错，但是软体方面可能还要再加强。但是我们这个标准就介于硬体跟软体中间，你硬体如果定得好就好。我过去是那个 ICANN-DEC 的台湾代表，那个多参加国际事务有个好处，我举个小例子。那最近我一个同学到广州去那个参加那个旅游活动，结果呢，他被那个中国移动的那个代理商在那边被坑了。大陆代表是推出田，他现在已经升电信管理局的副局长，做坑的费用退回给他，所以那个有时候多认识一些人脉，出去的话，我觉得是非常好的问题。各位有兴趣，当然，因为你在参加这个 IETF 之后呢，大家都是有兴趣的人聚在一起，所以对整个那个部分那个非常有帮助。那个全球那个资讯接触快，那现在我们最夯的一个题目，大家都知道，在这边 AI，那发展所有那个真正最有钱的都在做 AI。那我们在网络有个开玩笑AI 就台湾化的中国化的悲哀，所以大家要都跟着时代来做，所以各位可以从先开始，然后再参与，然后到引导，这是整个每个人学习 的时候，我刚成立的时候，我连机长们就是什么东西都搞不清楚。后来搞到后面最后，那我参加了以后，那我也提一个过去那个做的一些工作的话，有跟各位有些关联的，我写给大家以后参与国际事务的参考。我当时参加的时候，后来发现对一个我们中文网页名称开放，结果因为两岸之间我们是繁体字，他们是简体字。那个台湾的湾有两种写法，有繁体的湾，那个中国的国有繁体的那个国，也有简体的国。结果两岸联合到 ICANN 跟他要求，我要两个网页名称，那个 CCTL 的要两个。ICANN 说不可能，这个国家为两个，我们就把整个情形两岸一起去联合说服他，也通过 IETF 是可行，所以就是争取的台湾的湾有两个，一个简体一个正体，这是我想替他们这个同学很清楚，就是两岸意见相同的时候很好说。两岸都真的很高兴，到那个布鲁塞尔那边开庆功宴都在一起开。但是后来我参加一个就争取点政府中文网页名称点政府，大陆国台办跳出电信部分没有人反对，国台办跳出来说这违反一中原则，怎么办？那我说这个违反一中原则，他申请点政府。日本人也反对，大陆因为那个后来就叫香港出来反对。那后来我最后怎么处理方式呢？因为我要开会的时候刚好在北京开，我就跟他讲说，搞清楚那个两岸分治是事实。那现在两个分开，如果多争取一点资源，对两岸是不是好事？哦，那个另外一个不，你这个名称给我好还是？因为你不能再申请，你给我还是给日本人好？哇，一听，然后就是我们点政府这个译名替他们有在维院，所以很多东西出去国际事务上，出去跟人家谈的时候，除了想我们会做的比较好，所以那个我们这次的研讨会，我们非常那个。探讨，等一下我们会请那个瑞意半导体做瑞意半加很多的那个工作，有一些国际组织、一些技术联盟的工作给大家分享。那各位如果有问题的话，可以记下来，等一下结束了可以问他，甚至等一下如果黄秘书长能够留下来的话，一起用餐，也可以利用用餐时间剥夺他的时间。我想这整个国际舞台的部分，从开始学习历练到最后，你可以从发了跟人家，然后最后是一条走，所以我们很希望台湾能培育这些方面的人才。我想下来的时间，我想就不耽误大家太多，还是请黄副处长给大家我们讲开示一下，好，大家是不是鼓掌欢迎？谢谢，谢谢，好。
谢谢各位。长官、各位贵宾还有各位先进，大家好我是瑞意半导体的那个专案开发处的副处长。今天很荣幸来参加这个 IETF 的会议。其实 IETF 的重要性是无可言喻啦，因为我几乎整个学生时代都跟他在混嘛。因为我们东西接入 Internet， 我就必须要很了解 IFC， 所以大概跟 IETF 的渊源是我真的是很早就开始了。我们在台湾，因为瑞意半导体是设计跟网通相关的硬体嘛，所以我们其实对 protocol 也要有一定的掌握，我们才能设计出正确的硬体达到更好的 performance。所以 IETF 的 spec 或者是 IFC 对我们来讲是很重要的。尤其是如果台湾的 ICT 要参与这个国际的 Internet connection， 如果不了解未来的发展趋势，你可能就不太有办法设计出一个 well compatible to 这个 protocol 的 devices。所以这个重要性当然就是我觉得是非常重要的。我们台湾的 ICT 如果去参加这样掌握一些比较先进的 protocol 相关的知识之外，甚至如果你比较大力的去参与这个活动，你也可以在这个 protocol 或是标准的制定上有更多的发言权。就是上午场由我来当引言人嘛，那今天第一场就是说我们很荣幸的邀请到 Ethnic 的 Goeff Huston 先生啊，他不仅是 IETF DNS 的 Directorate 的主席跟 Reviewer， 同时他也担任了那个 IEPG 的资料Material Manager。那他整个流程，今天很荣幸的可以请他来指导我们。
Hi, my name is Goeff Huston. I have been asked to talk to you about the IETF, and I prepared some material which is hopefully all you wanted to know about the IETF. This talk is in English. I'm sorry, I know very little Chinese. Shishi is about all I can manage. So this is in English, and for that I apologize. Hopefully the AI bot is doing its work and translating my words as I say them. So, is this really all you wanted to know? Well, probably not. The questions are as varied as the number of people, but I'll try and share my experience as a very long-standing participant in the IETF in this presentation, and the perspectives that I've gathered over the years. I started in the IETF when I went to my first meeting. That wasn't the IETF's first meeting. They'd already had 14 meetings before I had gone, and my first was actually in November 1989 in Honolulu. At the time, the internet was undergoing a fascinating transition from a research network tightly bound to the US Advanced Research Project Agency, variously known as ARPA or DARPA. Sorry, these slides are running away on me. And that transition was occurring over to the research arena, because just a couple of years before that, the National Science Foundation had announced its supercomputer strategy and was purchasing 6 supercomputers in the West and connecting researchers all over the country to these supercomputers using an internet network, using the IP protocols that were previously part of the ARPA world. And as part of that process, a lot of effort and attention was turned to the IETF, as this was going to be the foundation for these academic and research networks. Now, the IETF, that was the 15th meeting. The most recent meeting was IETF 123 in Madrid in July of this year. And there's one coming up the week after next in Montreal. That will be the 124th. I think I've attended at least 100 of them, but to be perfectly frank with you, I've lost count. I have no idea how many I have gone to. It just fades away. I have served as a member of the Internet Architecture Board, and I will paint the picture of where that sits later on, but I was there for 6 years, from 1999 until 2005. And I've chaired a number of so-called working groups, which is where the IETF does its work. The first one was in IPv6 transition, then there was multi-homing in V6, then there was the BGP routing table growth, and most recently the secure inter-domain routing protocol working groups, all of which over the years I've chaired. I'm currently working in the DNS more than anything else, and I'm the co-chair of this DNS directorate, which sounds, I think, a little bit grander than it really is. The job of this particular bunch of volunteers is to review and comment on working documents that make mention of or leverage or advance the domain name system. And it's really a case of trying to get some expertise in the domain name system to be applied to these drafts to make sure that the documents aren't stupid, to actually make sure that they're accurate, useful, and saying the right thing. So I've covered a fair area, V6, inter-domain routing, bits of security, and more recently the domain name system, and along the way areas around transport, applications, and so on. Now, to sort of pull back a bit and actually look at the IETF itself, there's actually an interesting webpage, and I've pulled a couple of snippets from it, that lists all the 123 meetings so far. And I thought I'd sort of pull out the first three here. The first meeting at the IETF was early January 1986. It had 21 attendees. At this stage, it was an outgrowth of the Defence Advanced Research Project Agency. And there were a small number of folk who were interested in this, and it was kind of picking up pace inside the academic and research world. So 21 attendees, which was about the size of that research community at the time in 86. They were doing 4 meetings a year at that point, which was pretty intense. And so the next meeting was just 4 months later in Aberdeen on the other side, on the east coast of the US. Probably the same 21 attendees, I really don't know. The third meeting had 18 attendees. I kind of mark this out because at this point, the intentions of the National Science Foundation and indeed the other research funding agencies of the United States government, National Aeronautical and Space Administration, NASA, the Department of Energy, or the others, were kind of tossing around how do we create a network infrastructure to support this sort of varied collection of researchers across certainly all of the continental United States, but also reaching into other parts of the world as well. Now, the other part of this is that at the time, this was a world of mainframe computers and proprietary networks. And that's not what they were after. They weren't after an IBM network or a digital equipment network or anything else like that. They were interested in a network that was independent of the vendors, that was openly available. Now, in 86, that was a pretty big call. And so the amount of sort of horsepower to put behind this was pretty limited. And so the 18 attendees was kind of, I suppose, the number of folk who could actually spend the time and effort to go to these meetings. Things moved quickly in the same way that the NSF did in the United States moved quickly. That period between 1986 and 1993-94 was rapid expansion of academic and research networks. We built one in Australia, one was built in Taiwan, there were networks being built in Singapore, across most of Western Europe, and there was strong interest all over the world in the academic and research community into deploying the internet protocols. And after a whole bunch of meetings in the United States, the IETF felt brave enough to venture across the Atlantic and had their first non-North American meeting in Amsterdam in July 1993. And you see there the number of attendees, 493, of which, as I seem to recall, so I was certainly there, yes, around half were European. So very strong interest in this, well beyond the US, and the attendance reflected that. It wasn't long after that that it got even bigger. Every meeting was bigger than the previous one. At the end of that year, the end of next year, December 94, a meeting in San Jose, which is of course the heart of Silicon Valley, was the first IETF of 1,000 attendees, which at the time was considered big stuff. The next I marked was one in Stockholm in 1995. And the reason why is that up until that period, there was still a residual link between the work and the research of the internet and various parts of the US Defence's Advanced Research Project Agency. The IAB, the Internet Architecture Board, was appointed by what the best I can say is a small group of insiders who had strong associations with the Advanced Research Project Agency. It was still, I don't know, the influence was still there. But in 1995, there was a move by the folk who were at that ITF to go, we're big enough to do this ourselves. We don't need these bodies to work in the background to support our work. We can do this ourselves. We can run this as a standalone body and actually do the work ourselves, fund the work ourselves, and operate as an independent international standards body. And it was then, 95, I think, that really the ITF grew up a little bit into this area of being an international standards body. Now I'm going to fast forward, whiz through the next 30 years. And in some ways, it was living that life of being an international standards body. And the most recent meeting that we held, late July, had 1,000 on-site participants, okay, and another 543 who have registered to participate online in the same way that I'm doing here today. And a lot of time and effort has gone into an investment in making the online experience not quite the same. We miss the hallway conversations, but in every other respect, you certainly are part of contributing to the work that's being done in those meetings. So here's the larger picture, and it's certainly a number of trends are very, very visible. The explosive rise in interest from 1986 all the way up to the internet boom. And the ITF, the height of the internet boom was late 2000, where there were 2,700 attendees at one meeting. I think again it was San Diego. I think it was in December where the rest of America was cold, but San Diego was predictably warm and sunny. And then the internet bubble just burst. And there were a lot of casualties when the internet bubble burst. And the IETF certainly was part of that. And in succeeding meetings, attendance has dropped down from 2,500, 2,000, then below 1,500 to a steady state in the mid-noughties, 2005 and so on, at around 1,000 people per meeting. So in some ways that was the new reality, that the IETF wasn't new and exciting. It was doing a job on standards of technology. And that had a core of participants, originally very heavily dominated by Cisco, and at the time it was called Wellfleet, the two major vendors of routing equipment. We're still seeing Juniper and Wellfleet. I think Juniper got bought by HP recently, and strong participation at that level. But at the same time, we've also seen many other companies, not the least of which is Huawei from China, sending a lot of people to these meetings. Now, we've always had the ability to attend remotely, but we never tracked it. Since 1990, you could dial into these meetings and run various protocols, the M-bone, the multicast bone, and so on. But it was around 2015 that we formalized this as the ability to actually register as a remote attendee. And for a few years, there were around 200 to 300 folk who were doing this remotely. But all of a sudden, of course, when COVID really got stuck in, we relied on it completely. And for a little over a year and a half, there were no face-to-face meetings, only remote attendees. We're getting back into a new normal, and Madrid is a good example. Around about 1,200 attendees in person, 500 remotely, making a total of around 1,600 folk or so who attended that meeting. So in some ways, it's not really tapering off. If you count the two together, the level of attendance is around 1,200 to 2,000 folk, one way or another, with the most recent trends being around 1,500. These meetings are big. They're not as big as some. The International Telecommunications Union, the ITUT, holds its plenary every 4 years, and I think it lasts for a month, which is a bit of a marathon. The IETF meets 3 times a year, and they meet across 7 days. So the formal work of the IETF in developing standards is done in working groups, groups of interested folk who share an interest, who work together to develop document specifications in particular. And that's the core of the IETF. How does a working group get started? Well, we need to understand if there's a level of interest to work on a problem. And the way we do that is a less formal session, which we call BOFs, or birds of a feather, which are intended to gather folk who are interested in working on a problem. They're kind of working groups in formation sessions. Sometimes there's sufficient interest and sufficient understanding, a shared understanding of a problem, to move on to a working group, but it's not assured. Sometimes we just don't know enough about the problem. There's not enough interest in developing a solution. We're not sure what we're doing. And in that case, those sessions don't lead anywhere. But normally a working group might start with 1 or 2 birds of a feather session. And if it makes sense, if we understand what we're doing, it'll then form in a working group by about the 3rd round. The IETF is grouped into areas, and we'll see how that's structured a little later. But some of these areas hold their own meetings. So everyone with an interest in routing, or an interest in transport, or an interest in security. There are area-wide sessions where more general topics that don't sit inside any particular working group are considered. The IETF, and indeed the internet, it's not a solved problem. It's not, well, we know what we're doing and everything's good. Quite the opposite. I think there are many more things that we don't know than the few things that we do. And from its antecedents of the internet in the research and academic sector, the IETF has always been very, very open to participation by academics and researchers. And it got formalized quite early on in the process into what we call the IRTF, the Internet Research Task Force, which meets in the same week and has sessions for its research groups to actually meet. There are sessions where we all try and get together in the one room. The original meetings had the plenaries every morning, and that was pretty marathon, really, and I'm not sure we were getting much out of it. So these days, the plenary sessions are held one evening, just one meeting in the week, where we go through a lot of the formalities of the IETF, the various reports from each of the folk, and possibly topics of interest. The week also starts with the education group that normally have a number of tutorials. Some of them is how the IETF works, a bit like what you're having right here and now, and we're talking out here, and others about technologies. For some years, Joao Damas and I did one on a deep dive into the way the domain name system works as a tutorial, trying to explain where we are with this technology, the issues that are topical, and where the IETF is spending its effort. It's sort of the explanations that you don't get in working groups. There are social events. The organizer in each venue organizes an outing somewhere where there's normally food and drink and conversations to be had. And in the weekend before the IETF, the 7-day session, the Saturday and Sunday before, there's things called hackathon and code sprints that become very popular, where interested folk get into the same room and try and develop solutions around recent internet drafts or even soon to be published RFCs. And of course, there's a whole bunch of side meetings, business meetings, and everything else. And of course, as well as that, the hallway conversations that you'd never have in your workplace, because there just aren't the richness and diversity of folk there that you find in an IETF. There are editing sessions brought up to try and hammer through a problem. Informal brainstorming, often called bar-boffs because they're not typically held at the hotel bar. And of course, to remind us back to that T-shirt from Honolulu, yes, there are many fine lunches and dinners on the way through, and possibly as important as anything else. Where do we meet? Well, you've had a bit of a taste of it. Originally, right up until 1993, and that meeting in Amsterdam, they met in US locations exclusively. Well, not quite. They had a couple of excursions into Canada, into Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal. But basically, it was US. The first venture across the Atlantic was in Europe in 1993 to Amsterdam. And the first meeting in the Asia Pacific region wasn't until 7 years later, in the year 2000, in Adelaide. And these days, there's almost a more formal form of rotation that for the 3 meetings each year, we have a meeting in the Asia Pacific region, a meeting in North America, and a meeting in Europe, and very occasionally a meeting in Southern America. I seem to recall we've had a meeting in Buenos Aires, but I don't remember when. I'm sorry. So if you look at meetings close to us, here's the meetings that have been done in the last, 25 years, starting in March 2000, Adelaide, Yokohama, Seoul, and then basically Hiroshima, Beijing, Taipei in November 2011. Some of you might have been there. I certainly was, as I recall. I'll call Honolulu part of Asia Pacific. Geographically, it is. Culturally, I doubt it. And of course, there has been a couple of meetings. The most recent meeting in China, it was Beijing in November 2010. The upcoming meetings, Montreal is coming this October. And at the start of next year, the March meeting will be in Shenzhen in China. Now, what is the IETF other than many fine lunches and dinners? It's a standards body. What's a standard? It's a specification of a technology that major purpose is buyers and sellers can agree on what they're buying and what they're selling. In other words, this is a cup for all our purposes. Now, there might be a standard on the size of the handle and its strength, so it's useful as a cup. There might be a standard on the amount of volume that can contain, because this is a standard size cup. There are standards for all kinds of things. Some are quite formal, some are less so. You might be aware that there's a body in Paris that looks after the standard of what is a gram, what is a litre, what is length, a metre. There's also standards around the world for time. What is a second? So these are things in our world where we're trying to put a strict definition on a term, but other times these standards are trying to produce a description of a product where many people can produce that product. And a buyer can be assured that no matter who they buy it from, which producer produces that specification, it will conform to a particular specification of behaviour. It will behave in a standard way. Now, standards are typically simply called that, standards. But due to a sort of strange historical work going back to the 70s, the IETF called its standards documents requests for comment. The original work, which was strongly research-oriented, were considered to be tentative offerings. Offerings that said, here's our understanding, but if you know more, if you have some further commentary, we'd be pleased to hear your input. We'd be pleased to gather what you know and integrate it in. So that terminology, request for comment, has persisted. Now, here's another time series graph, and it mirrors to some extent the attendance at IETF meetings, but it goes back earlier because the first RFCs were produced in the late 1960s, which is almost the start of this project. And there was a flurry of standards in 72, 73, 74 around the early standardization of TCP/IP, as it was known then, including the definitions of IP, the definition of TCP, and the definition of UDP. Things went quiet after that until around 1988, until around the period where this work got picked up by the National Science Foundation and became a national network for the academic and research community. And this then led to some landmark RFCs, 791 and 793, the definition of IP, what became later version 4, and 793, the definition of TCP. 4 years later, the first of the efforts, I've got that year wrong, it was 1995, 1883, IPv6, and the first definition of the domain name system, November 1987, and 95, the first definition of the Border Gateway Protocol. Things kept on getting faster. We were producing RFCs until the peak was 2006, where a little over 450 RFCs were published in a year. It seems to have been a very busy year. But then things have taken off, and the current rate is a lot slower than that, around about 160 RFCs a year. Why? Quality versus quantity. I think a lot of the problem space has been looked at, and these days the areas of refinement and redefinition are perhaps a slightly lower volume of standards than the first exploratory work in trying to document almost everything. But you know, it's still going at around 160 odd RFPs per year, which is about what the organisation can cope with. So, as I note here, peak meeting attendance 2000, peak RFC publication 10 years later, and currently the rate is about half that, at around 200 RFCs a year. Now, I don't know about each of you, but I have been on more standards bodies than just the idea. And I must admit, this is very different. A lot of the standards bodies, even in technology, have a strong government presence. They actually have government representatives that attend these standards meetings. Often they're lawyers. And so it's all about definition of terms. Even quantum computing has a standards body, which is basically one where governments have representation. And they spend a lot of their time in terminology and almost none of their time in specification of the technology itself. Now, the ITF is not that. It's not a big body. It's not national standards bodies. It's none of those. There are no government representatives. So it's not the ISO, the National Standards Organisation. It's not the IEC. None of those. It is a technology body. It's not founded on any form of international treaty. The ITU, the ITUT in particular, can look back to a treaty which was taken on by the United Nations, but the treaty itself dates back to the 19th century. Countries wishing to exchange communication, there's no such treaty. Oddly enough, it even has no formal membership. There's no qualifications. You don't need to prove that you know something to participate in the ITF. It helps if you do, because, as I said, it is a technology body, and some of the conversations are quite sophisticated, but there's no qualification, there's no entry requirements. If you're interested, you're more than welcome to participate to see if it matches your interest. Because there's no formal membership, there's no way of doing voting or ballots or any other formal means of counting expression, counting some kind of expression of support or opposition. Now, that's a little bit stretching. We do senses of the room. Sometimes we ask the working group to sort of voice up if they're in favour of a certain action, but we don't then go and count. We don't. We're trying to understand the broad agreement behind something without necessarily saying, well, 51 versus 49, that kind of vote. We don't do that. There's a number of documents that define our process, and you might claim the process is quite fixed, but that's not quite true. It's all quite flexible at the same time. Unlike many other standards bodies, the IETF does not make its money from selling those standards. They're openly available, no charge, no constraint. They're copyrighted by the IETF, they're freely available. And they're not part of any government mandate. There's no forcing function to say, you must build technology that adheres to an RFC. They don't have that imprimatur of mandatory adoption. It's a voluntary industry code that sellers and buyers can choose to reflect the products they want by listing in the RFCs of the standards they wish to see that product comply with. So it's more an industry-based structure around agreeing around what is a standard behaviour of a technology. So it's culture. Its culture is not formal. They aren't representatives. It doesn't matter which company employs you, or even if you work for a government. That has no standing in the IETF. It's a very fluid collection of folk who are interested in the topics being discussed. That's it. And if there's an IETF meeting that has no working groups you're interested in, you don't have to attend. There's no concept of standing membership. Each of us contribute to the work of a working party based on their own interest and expertise. And those contributions are not secret, not qualified. There's no such thing as non-disclosure. They're openly available, and your contributions permit the IETF process to develop those contributions. So it's not that the IETF standardises your technology or my technology. That's not the case. We can offer views, opinions, and even technologies. But it's really up to the IETF and that grouping to work out what they want to do with that, if anything. So there's no constraint. The culture is open. Very occasionally, the IETF has wandered into political subjects. Most recently, in 2014, post-Snowden, they put out an RFC which said pervasive monitoring of network activity is a technical attack, and we should work on protocols that try and mitigate that, which is an overtly political statement. An earlier one dating, back to I think 98 or so, a policy on wiretapping that said, yes, we know law enforcement agencies want to wiretap and tapping into protocols that the IETF has standardised as part of this. But we're not going to integrate that in our standards. That's not where we want to be. That kind of expresses a culture of the IETF, which is, I suppose, informally described as liberal and slightly leftist leaning. Perhaps a West Coast technologist view, the view that Silicon Valley, before the billionaires took over, was renowned for. These days, though, I think that culture is disappearing under the weight of the huge digital megaliths that we currently have invading our world. The culture, it's informal. It's techno-nerd. There is no dress code. Yes, get dressed. Better than not. But there's no hierarchy. There's no deference to anyone in charge. Because these are smart and often extremely opinionated individuals. And you could certainly say that their people skills are not as high as you might find in other venues. So what others might see as rude, arrogant, or aggressive, an IETF person might interpret it as saying, I told you what I thought. That's what I said. And if something says, well, that makes no sense, then you're likely to see that feedback at the IETF. That makes no sense. Go and rethink what you're saying. Because it's a culture that tries to say what's right and not couch it in terminology that diffuses that. I suppose it's an American culture in some ways of being quite blunt and direct, which is carried through into the IETF. How do you measure success? Well, it's not the number of meetings, the number of attendees, it's not in the number of RFCs. Success for the IETF is the fact that the world uses these protocols to run the global communication system. That is the measurement of success. Success is an industry metric of market adoption, not forced by governments, not mandated, simply that sellers and buyers and deployers, operators, see these technology specifications as useful and productive in ensuring that the technology interoperates. And to do that, you kind of look at, well, what's the purpose of the IETF? Well, it's to produce those very standards that drive the internet. Now, what's in scope for the IETF and what is it? It's hard to tell. We don't know. Sometimes it's kind of, well, bring it in and let's see if we want to work on it. Other times it's, well, other people are working on that. We're not going to duplicate it. The IEEE's work and local area networks, the work in radio by the 3GPP and by ITUR and others, work in optical standards, not in the IETF. Why? Other folk are doing it. There's no need that the IETF replicates other people's work. That's just confusing and a waste of time. They do, though, take on work that is consistent with making the internet work. It's consistent with securing the internet, but in some ways it's sort of the application rather than the fundamental technologies. For example, we talk about security in terms of applying cryptographic algorithms to our protocols, but we don't talk about those cryptographic algorithms themselves. We're not the folk who build them. We're not the folk who standardize them. That's someone else's work. So how do you get to that? Well, the IETF will work on something if folk want to work on it. And if folk don't want to work on it, it ain't going to happen. It's almost self-selecting. Secondly, that we do a good job in standardizing it. It's secure and can be operated securely. Now, as I say here, I think that's a little bit ambitious. Think about security is perhaps a better way of saying it. Don't make protocols that are unsafe, unwise, and don't work. Try and avoid absolutism, but at the same time, make protocols that scale, make protocols, make technology that does the job. And of course, in something like the internet, which just keeps on growing and growing and growing, make technology that can grow with it. Unrelenting growth has been a feature of the internet for the last 30 odd years. And we have got to build technologies that can withstand that enormous scaling pressure. And so one of the questions is, well, what happens if the network is 3 times as big? Is what you're saying still viable? Does it work under scaling pressure? And the IETF is not funded by the US government. It's not controlled by them. It's not controlled by your government or my government. It's open and it's fiercely independent and highly opinionated. It's not captured by Google or Cisco or Microsoft or Huawei. It's not an option. It's fiercely independent. And they take efforts to ensure that that remains the case. So one of the things that Dave Clark from MIT said some time ago, there's no one in charge. There's no king's presidents and voting. We believe in doing the right thing based on common agreement, underlined by the fact that the specification can produce code that works. And that's almost all I have to say. The following bullet points on that slide try and flesh that out. But the issue is the IETF seeks to gauge a consensus amongst the folk who are there about what's the right thing to do. That's not unanimity, and it's not a borderline vote. It's trying to steer down what we all think as technologists as decent outcomes that actually facilitate running code as an outcome. It doesn't matter who sent you or who funds you. You're not here to represent their views. Now, that's a bit idealistic, in fact, very idealistic in some cases. And some companies certainly have attitudes and an agenda at the IETF. But it's a difficult thing to carry through because the IETF makes no sort of difference in listening to you if you're employed by Google, by APNIC, or anyone else. We're all individuals. That's all we are. All RFCs don't credit the companies, they credit the authors. There's no anonymity here. The contributions are contributed by individual. And that's a long-standing convention coming basically from the research world. It's the work of people, not the work of companies. Now, I think these days that's a little bit idealistic, and there's certainly a certain amount of corporate influence, and even governments have agendas here. But nevertheless, the ethos of the IETF is that doesn't really count. And in some ways, you still need to be saying things that gain common consensus if you wish to be heard. It's also not a school. It's not a university, nothing like that. If you want to learn, don't come to the IETF. It's not here to teach you. You're meant to have learned it already because the IETF won't help you to familiarize yourself with it. Working group sessions start as soon as the hour ticks over in the deep end. They assume that folk in the room or folk on the mailing list have read the drafts. They're ready to contribute to the discussion. If you haven't, you'll get a lot less out of a meeting. You have to do your homework first. The IETF is not there to help you get familiar. So the work starts with a draft, which is basically some ideas. They may be pretty rough. They're only held in a repository for 6 months and then they're deleted. They're meant to be what we call ephemeral. There for the moment. Help us get started. Define the points. May not be a polished document. Probably isn't. But they're where to start going. Then it gets adopted by a working group. If we all think that there's enough impetus behind making it better, polishing it. And the working group is there to actually pull the document into place, respond to items, review, and develop the technology to the point where we think it's ready. The working groups have chairs and they do a last call. If they believe it's good, it goes to an Internet Engineering Steering Group, and then it gets passed through to the RFC editor and ultimately becomes an RFC. We used to think we were fast. We're not. This process takes around 4 to 6 years in general because standards are not trivial. They're not quick. They're well considered, and hopefully they're relevant. I'm going to go very fast now because I'm running out of time. You can't ask the IETF to adopt your technology. We prefer to standardize technologies that are open, and if there are licensed, they're licensed royalty-free. That's what we prefer. We maintain the right to copy, publish, distribute, and even modify or prepare derivative works. That's the IETF's claim. If you take work to the IETF, you'll be asked to sign over to that level. So the IETF tends to work on open technologies by preference. Now, we're divided, as I said before, into the IETF and the IRTF, a secretariat to do all the hard work. In the IETF itself are 8 areas: general apps, web, transport, internet routing, ops, and security. And the IRTF is slightly different. There are currently 16 research groups around areas of common interest. And on top of this is the Internet Architecture Board that has an oversight of the process, external liaisons, and oversight of the protocol parameter registries. Other things, there's a trust to hold the intellectual property, the legal stuff. There's an RFC editor that actually produces these documents. A separate way of producing RFCs if you really, really feel that your work is so important, but the IETF hasn't managed to produce an RFC. And there's a nominating committee to actually understand how to fill these leadership positions on the IESG and the IAB in particular over each year. So we try and fulfill our own vacancies from within the body of the IETF. The IETF operates with a fund of around $12 million a year. Half of it is actually gathered from meetings revenue. Meetings aren't cheap. To attend a meeting in person is around $1,000 US, maybe a bit more. And the other half of the money, or maybe a bit more, actually comes from the Internet Society. There is work to actually build an endowment fund to change that around over time, but it's a long-term issue. Do we develop technology? We used to say we do, we don't anymore. IPv6 is about the last time we really did that, and the design by committee is never a good idea. These days, we tend to take in contributions by others and push it through working groups. Does every RFC become code? Not necessarily. Vendors are not interested in chasing down every RFC and implementing it just for the fun of it. It's an expensive process. And many vendors wait for the document to actually come out as an RFC before considering whether to implement it or not. So this whole idea of running code is these days perhaps more aspirational than real, because running code is not cheap. Where are we going? Well, we're going wherever the internet's going. I don't know where that is. It's powered by participation. There's no government signed up. There's no vendors signed up. We're all here because for each of us, we think it's worth doing. We're interested in developing that technology and are interested in volunteering our time. The pay rate for IETF roles is zero. It's about as bad as you get. You're there on your own sort of dollar. If you can convince your employer, great. But nevertheless, it's based on your volunteering of your time one way or another. Without that level of support from everyone around you to work in this, the IETF will die. So in some ways, the future of the IETF is largely up to you. It's up to your willingness to contribute, to participate, to join the mailing lists, and actually submit drafts to discuss them, to discuss with your peers and develop that technology. So I've gone a little bit over time. I hope that's okay, but I'll hand it back now. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Huston, for your presentation. And my question is that does the IETF have the sunset policy for the outdated RFCs? Thank you.
No, it does not have an automatic sunset policy. If you and a collection of likewise interested people think that an RFC is no longer useful or even unsafe, you can certainly see if there's interest in writing an RFC to say, no, don't read that RFC anymore. It has been, in the American terminology, deprecated. And there have been efforts to try and do that for IPv4. I think they're ill-advised. But there's also been efforts to try and say, look, this particular technology is really, really unwise to use. Like, for example, Telnet. It's a nightmare security-wise. Don't use it. So yes, there is an ability to deprecate. But all RFCs never change. So if you wish to say, well, that bit there is wrong, you know better now. You can't change the RFC. You can't. What you can do is produce a new RFC that either says, I refer back to RFC 20. Section 3 is wrong, you should read this. And that's a fine RFC. Like that. Or you can say, this RFC obsoletes RFC 20 completely. Don't read RFC, read this new RFC, which effectively replaces one with another. But RFCs themselves don't change. So they can be deprecated, updated, or obsoleted in various ways, but the contents of them never change in any case. So some RFCs or some technologies have had, I think, 6 or 7 revisions. Go look at IPv6 or the Border Gateway Protocol, BGP, as we do more things with it. We just produce another RFC that describes the current state of affairs. Nothing automatic. Some things are still out there and still relevant. RFC 791 might be dating back to 89 or something. Still relevant today. Still accurate. Still right.
Thank you, the Jeff. Okay, have another question to ask Jeff. Okay, if we have no question, we thank the Jeff again. Thanks.
Thank you very much.